Hey guys, welcome back to game 4 of the World Chess Championship. We just saw the conclusion of the game between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Magnus with the white pieces. So without further ado, let's get into the action. Everyone was wondering, how is Magnus going to start game number 4? This is the second time that Magnus has the white pieces. And so far we've seen all draws in the match. E4 was actually the beginning of the game. So a bit surprising. Magnus played d4 last time. Obviously, not only are players at this level very capable of switching up the first move of the game that they play, but Magnus especially has, tons of versatility and plays d4 and e4, depending on what type of game he's looking to elicit from his opponent. We see e5 quickly from Nepomniachtchi, knight f3, and knight f6, which indicates immediately that we see a Petrov. Now, this opening is not something that Nepomniachtchi normally plays. This is not, in his repertoire as something that you might expect as a top choice. So I think Magnus, as someone playing e4 in a World Championship match, he's going to be prepared for this opening, but it probably wasn't his main expectation, if I had to guess. And we see knight takes e5, the main way to play it, d6, knight back to f3, and knight takes e4. So both players collect the pawns in the middle, and knight c3 was not played in the game, but this is kind of the more trendy way to play nowadays. You play knight c3, black takes, you take back with the d pawn, and as you can see, both bishops are open very nicely here, and white often plays bishop e3, queen d2, long castle, and depending what black does, if they short castle, for example, often you get a big attack going. And this is sort of the more modern, trendy, recent way to play as white, knight c3. But we saw Magnus go for the move d4. Definitely a very standard move, d5, and I think here both of the players, bishop d3, d6, castle, castle, are getting some of the very natural moves out of the way. c4. This is the idea. I think one of the most jarring things about the Petrov defense is that it almost feels like in this position that you're almost down a move as white. Because, as black, if the knight was here, it would be a symmetrical position. But instead, black has the knight on e4, and it almost feels like black has an extra move. So it's a bit of a strange opening, but the move c4 reminds us why white is the one who's actually playing for the slight advantage, because the knight on e4 is actually a piece that white is trying to treat as a little overextended. That white's bishop is attacking it, and now the pawn is attacking the d5 pawn, which supports the knight. So white is playing against that and saying, look, your knight on e4 is way ahead of the rest of your army. It's too far forward, and it's overextended. So c4 targets the d5 pawn, which undermines the whole setup that black has. c6, of course. Rook e1, once again, threatening to win a pawn. Bishop f5. So I think, once again, the moves are pretty standard here. Queen b3 is the selection from Magnus. And really, at this point, you could be picking any moves. But Magnus clearly has an intention. In a World Championship match, you usually don't... You can't just prepare the opening and, say, yeah, I looked at the engine, this is good. You have to prepare further than that. You have to prepare a middle game plan. That's what, at this elite World Championship match level, that's what it's all about. So Magnus, queen b3, queen d7, this is still very standard theory. Once again, keeping in mind this pawn is not hanging due to the very common trick. Bishop takes h2, uncovering the attack on d5 from the queen. Knight c3. And again, this is all very standard stuff. So I don't even think we've reached the point where Magnus is going to unveil his plan, so to speak, because we've all seen this before in this particular opening. b6, again, pretty standard theory. And queen b5 has also been played before. Queen d7. So once again, revisiting this threat. And the reason that I sort of jump ahead to this point is that now we start to see maybe what Magnus's intention was when he decided what line he was going to play against the Petrov defense. After a4, queen takes b5, a takes b5. This position has been seen on the board many times before. The pawn is actually very good here, so if black just develops the knight like this, then white's going to have tremendous pressure against this pawn, doubling the rook, something like that. The bishop on d2 will watch white's weakness on the c-file, but that pawn is very tough to defend, and this pawn very annoyingly covers squares that the knight wants to go to. So black usually plays the move a5. It's a protected pass pawn, and it just jumps ahead of this pawn. Now, this is where Magnus, clearly had his preparation, because the very standard move here, whether you're prepared or not, is the move b takes a6. This is, using en passant here. You take, let's say, something like this, and white's slightly better. These pawns are separated. They're a little weaker than white's two pawns here. It's not much. It really isn't. The engines are going to give 0.00 and all that jazz here. But this is the very common way to play. Now, if Magnus just goes ahead and plays that, it's clear he's not very ambitious with the white pieces. The World Championship match is all about bringing out new ideas and seeing if you can catch your opponent maybe in a main line, but with a new sideline idea. And the move knight h4 is that idea. Stunning move, just visually, it's kind of remarkable because it's a totally different plan. It lets black have that protected pass pawn, and it seems to want to play the move knight to f5, which is such an easy move to stop, g6. And I say it's an easy move to stop. Nepomniachtchi thought the same thing. He goes g6 immediately. And knight h4, clearly Magnus's prep, met by g6, right? And everyone's sort of scratching their head saying, what the heck is this guy doing? And then comes the next move, g4. And it starts to think in what the current world champion is up to. So g4 indicates that this knight is intending to reroute. And if black did not play this move, white would play knight f5, certainly, hitting the bishop. But the intent of that knight is to return to the e3 square, where it would hit this pawn and actually win it just outright. So g6 stops that, but g4 renews that threat. Not on f5, but on g2. Knight g2, knight e3, same idea. And for black, if they go and defend it, knight d7, knight f6, well, now you've got this g pawn that pushes to g5, and then you take the pawn. So immediately after the move g4, the engine, while it may not agree, Magnus has come up with a clear plan, and one that's very easy to understand as a human. Once you clue in to the fact that this is the intention to attack that weak pawn on d5, the g pawn not only is multi-purpose because of attacking the knight and providing the square for this knight to reroute to, but it also gives space for the king, and just generally g4 seems like it's accomplishing 2 to 3 things at once here. So that's the idea. New ideas in chess or in a world championship match like this, they do not mean that white's just winning or decisive. But what it does mean is that Nepomniachtchi is going to have to find a way to react to this that is fairly logical, because Magnus has a clear intent, and we see it being executed here, knight to g2. Again, knight f6 wouldn't make a lot of sense, I think, just playing against this. Now, I think it's still a very reasonable move, but it does play into white's plan, which is to get the move g5 in and then get the knight to e3. So Jan decides to go rook f to c8, which might look strange to some players, because you're thinking, why doesn't this rook go there and the other rook go to that square? Having a rook here to support the a pawn is actually pretty important. This pawn can run very quickly and will very often be used as a decoy. The move a4 followed by rook to a5, taking b5 is a very serious plan that black might have in the future. Also, any rook here does its job by attacking the c-pawn, so this rook has a job here, may as well get the other pieces working. Bishop to f4, so the intent with bishop f4 is to meet Bishop takes f4 with knight takes f4, and a similar idea to knight d3. The knight is looking to take the d5 pawn, which is very valuable in the current position. And Jan decides to capture it. I think that if we had seen, bishop back to f8, which is sort of the intention of this rook move, bring the bishop back, just go for the pawn here. Then, for example, something like this, and once the pawn's protected, white can continue with his plan of knight e3, and it's just not clear to me how this pawn gets protected, because the knight f6 square is never available due to this g5 move, or maybe bishop e5 as well. So he decides to take. Rook takes c3. There's no way to protect this pawn, so instead, black is just going to do a trade. I get your pawn, you get my pawn, and we'll go from there. Knight takes d5. Now rook d3, another very logical move. He's going after the d pawn, and Magnus continues. Rook to e7. So now rook takes d7 is a clear threat. The knight has to retreat, and when it retreats, it gives up not only this square, but it also undefends this pawn. We see the move knight f6 check in the game. If white had taken on b6, then black would play rook b8, and it's just that the d pawn is hanging, the knight's hanging. When the knight moves, the b pawn will be hanging. After rook d4, the g pawn is hanging with check. This is not a position that I think Magnus wants. So that's why you'll see in the game, Magnus shies away from taking this pawn, even though it looks like, hey, that's a free pawn, and it undermines the a pawn as well, making that weaker. But after rook b8, it's just so annoying to meet the threats in the position. So understandably, we see the move knight f6. Now after king g7, very logical, hitting the knight. The move was knight e8. The other try might be the move g5. I mean, it looks normal to protect the knight. But instead of playing rook takes d4 in this position, it's important to note that black is going to play the move knight e6. It hits this pawn, it hits this pawn, and this one is obviously more important to protect. So you might see the move h4. But then, rook d4 or knight d4, and this knight is jumping everywhere. His pawn's hanging left, right, and center. You really don't want to allow that knight to jump from f8 all the way into the action and start causing havoc, taking all your pawns. So instead of the move g5, we see knight e8, king g8, d5 cannot be taken, right? Be careful, the knight goes back to f6, but in this position, we go back to that idea that I was mentioning earlier of the decoy, right? Now we have this a pawn that can just shoot up the board. So that's pretty much sufficient counterplay because white's going to play knight f6, maybe cement the knight with g5. But black's king it's pretty safe as long as the king protects the pawn. What you don't want to do is allow rook takes f7 in any lines, but other than that, black's king is fairly safe here, and it's time to do something else. And the a pawn is the perfect source of reliable counterplay. a4, knight f6, g5, cementing the knight, but here comes a3. Right? And at this point, after a3, let's say that we see the move h4, for example, by white. Black plays a2 and keeps going with the pawn. Then white might actually consider dropping this rook back to e2. And this is kind of tricky. We see the move rook e2. You're looking to take this pawn. The knight is protecting this guy. And if you bring this rook to a3 to protect as well, then we might see d6. Right, and the issue with d6 is all of a sudden this pawn's getting very close to queening. This guy is not doing much. One of these rooks is going to have to deal with the d pawn, and then white can start taking the a pawn. Now imagine you trade this pawn for this pawn. I think white stands better. The knight is very strong, much better than the knight on f8, and the king for white is better than black's king. It can access the middle of the board. It's not about to get mated in any lines, so this is not a position that Nepomniachtchi wants to get into. So we see the move a3. Knight e8 was Magnus's choice. If the move h4 was played, I would not expect a2 from Jan. I would expect something a little bit more like h6, or maybe rook d4, attacking that pawn. These sorts of moves. Not committing a2 just yet. Right now it's on a good square. The rook's protecting it. It's also stopping d6. So all looks good in this position for both sides. It's tough to improve in either direction. So we see the move knight e8. You guys may already be guessing where this is going. King g8, knight f6, and we do see not a full repetition of moves, but rather once we see the knight starting to shuffle back and forth, Nepomniachtchi is ready to call the arbiter, and Magnus had no intention of playing on anyway, agreed to the draw, and we do see a draw in game 4. So Magnus Carlsen, Jan Nepomniachtchi, game 4 draw, a relatively quick game, but not one to underestimate. This knight h4 idea by Magnus was brand new, and I mean, I think Nepomniachtchi just reacted very well to it. It's hard to come up with, brand new move that's going to surprise the challenger to the world champion enough to, win in a match format like this. So really what you're going to see over these many games as part of the World Championship match are just attempts by both players to try to find those golden nuggets, those moves that surprise them enough that is actually too difficult to play, and they slip up, and you take that advantage and convert it into a full point. So far, we haven't seen that. I'll be back every day for the recaps. Game 5 will be tomorrow, but we have a draw here in game 4, and I'll see you guys next time.